a minute or so to come on in, and we'll go ahead and get started. There's a lot that we want to cover. I know this is a very popular topic that we've been talking about for a while. Certainly, as MemoryFox, it's probably the number one question that we get, which warms my heart that this is such an important topic to people in terms of fundraising ethically. So, right, we're up to 72, 73. Hey, while people are coming in, why don't you all, if you feel like you want to, go ahead and drop in where you're calling in from and the name of your organization, maybe some information about your mission. You know, I think we're all united here by sort of our common interest in telling our stories ethically. So it's great to see organizations that share those common values. So go ahead and check out the chat. Maria's in the house. DC, of course, DC, KC. Great. Milpitas. Is that how you pronounce that? I'm not sure. In California. That sounds close, right?
I used to work in Milpitas,
Milpitas, okay.
California.
I've got that thick Buffalo accent. That makes it hard, as you know, to pronounce stuff sometimes.
You're so funny, Chris.
All right, 84. Wow, this is really, really awesome. Keep dropping those locations in. So cool to see it. All righty. Well, it's 3:02. So I'm just going to go ahead and launch into it. But I do have some special thanks that I want to go through, of course. Special thanks and gratitude to our esteemed panelists for taking the time to share their insights about ethical storytelling, specifically the various aspects of consent, which is our main topic for today. Here at MemoryFox, I've been introduced myself. I am the CEO of MemoryFox and founder. It is obviously a very great privilege to be able to be here with these great storytellers to talk about consent. Yeah, in MemoryFox, we are obsessed with consent, and we think it's the most important aspect of story collection. So we're really excited to dig into this and learn from our great panelists. We're going to ask some tough questions, right? These are not easy questions and they don't have easy answers, but they were all submitted by you, the people in the audience, to be able to help us all tell stories more ethically. So thank you to everyone who took the time to submit. We read through and we read every single one, and we sorted over 200 questions. A lot of good themes. So I think we did a good job, hopefully, of getting like the major themes that will apply to everybody. But it was no easy task. There's a lot of great pieces to cover. Of course, I would be remiss if I did not thank our wonderful, intrepid marketing director, Carly Euler, for putting this all together. She does such amazing work, and we're so privileged to have her. This session is being recorded and will be sent to everyone who registered within 24 hours of the event. So be on the lookout for that email from Carly in the next 24 hours. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our panelists. First, we have Allie Levine. She is an attorney and the founder of Levine Legal, which specializes in providing affordable and accessible legal services to small businesses and nonprofits. Before founding Levine Legal, Allie served as an in-house and outside counsel for a number of Connecticut businesses. In those roles, she represented clients in litigation and administrative proceedings related to employment, civil rights, and general liability. It's an honor and a privilege to have you today, an actual legal professional, to give their advice. Thank you so much, Allie, for being here. Next, we have Christy Scott. She is an email fundraising consultant. She works with small nonprofits to transform email campaigns from ineffective to impactful. She's been in the nonprofit sector for over a decade in programs, fundraising, and marketing. Her work is rooted in community-centric fundraising, and she co-organizes the Los Angeles chapter meetings for CCF. So if you're in the LA area, definitely check her out. She's professionally and personally committed to Black liberation and equity for all. Thank you for joining us today, Christy. Our third panelist today is my dear friend who I've gotten to know very well, Diana Farias Heinrich. She is the CEO and creative director at Habra Marketing. Habra Marketing provides communications, marketing, and storytelling services for nonprofits. Diana and her team take care of telling the world the incredible things their clients are doing and letting them get back to what they do best, changing lives and making the world a better place. Diana is also the creator of the Ethical Nonprofit Summit, which will be taking place on September 19th. I highly recommend it because especially we endorse it because we are our proud sponsor. And so really proud of Diana putting that together. I know it's a lot of hard work and it's really going to pay off in a beautiful, beautiful day for everyone. So nice to see you again, Diana. And last but not least, T. Clay Buck. He is a dynamic speaker and teacher and an internationally recognized thought leader in fundraising and nonprofit management. He is an experienced frontline fundraiser with over 3 decades of leading successful individual giving programs. Now an independent consultant and the founder of TCB Fundraising, Clay's expertise is on the intersection of data and systems and fundraising storytelling. Clay was also a contributor to MemoryFox's 2023 Ethical Storytelling Report, which we're very thankful for. So thank you for being with us today, Clay.
Thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Absolutely. So I'm going to mostly shut up now because I'm here to learn too, and we have some unbelievable panelists. So let's go ahead and get into it. All right. So the first question, this is a combo question from Alexa and Cynthia, and it is about collecting consent. And this one is going to be for Clay and Christy. When is the best time to collect consent during the interview/storytelling process? And who at the organization should be the one asking for and collecting that consent? Clay, we'll start with you.
Oh, wow. I was going to wait and see what Christy said first.
No
There
cheating.
you go, Clay. It's all you.
Right? I am a believer. Okay. At any point that you're talking to anybody about sharing anything, get consent then. I mean, that is first and foremost the number one approach, because it's not just consent to share the story, to use the story. It's consent to talk to you, consent to share your history. Hey, I want to talk to you about your background, your experience, what's happened with you. Get consent to have the conversation first, right? And as part of that, explain why we're having this conversation, what it is we want to know, and how it will be used. I also do recommend having some preset documentation that explains in very simple terms what we're doing, what we're talking about, what expectations are, and how it will be used up front, right? And if you get a signature or whatever, right, but get consent right from the start, even just to have the conversation and to tell the story at the outset.
Very, very early in the process, at the extreme beginning is kind of what you're saying. Christy, anything to follow up on that?
Absolutely. I mean, I just want to say, absolutely, it's all about getting permission right up front. And it's an ongoing process, getting consent with storytelling, like constantly checking in with folks, because often, especially folks in vulnerable positions, they may not realize that until later that they don't want to do something. And the moment they may say yes initially. So making sure you continue to check in with them. And I think that connects a lot. I'm glad also we have this question about who at the organization would be a good choice to collect consent. And I usually advise that folks look into whoever's closest to the person at the organization. For example, if they have like a case manager for a human services organization, then getting a partnership with the program side to see if they can talk to them about consent and make sure that they're being honest about it, because there are power dynamics when we ask for consent. And so that's why it's so key to have someone they really trust who they can be honest with, collecting stories, or at least asking for consent, even if someone else is going to follow up later.
Yeah, and even asking somebody on the spot, there's an implication there that, well, you have to do this, or making it's contingent
and
on
saying
it.
You can think about it is, I'm such a big fan of saying you can think about it. You know,
beautiful.
Especially if someone seems hesitant or unsure of what they're getting into, you can think about it. I can send you more details before you decide. Like, there's just so many ways to really think about it and make sure that the power dynamic is kind of like almost nothing if possible. You know, there's always going to be a little bit, but making sure you are checking in with them constantly is.
Giving people the time and space to be able to make the decision.
Yes, don't have it be rushed. Oh no emergency storytelling, please.
We need a success story. We need
I
one
know
tomorrow.
we've been there, but let's try not to do it.
Can I just
Yeah.
add to what Christy said, being very conscious, because the part of the question was who should ask, right? The power dynamic is key, because that's really what needs to be balanced whenever you're talking about consent, agreement, involvement, engagement, is that power dynamic. And I'm going to go ahead and own this right from the outset here. I am an older white cis male. I get it, right? So when I'm in the situations, what I try to do is make sure that whoever I am working with is balancing that power dynamic. Because if I ask as a chief development officer, as a white cis older male, there's a very different response, or can be. So be very conscious in consent gathering and story gathering on what those power dynamics could be.
Yes, totally agree.
Yeah. Visualizing those invisible like power structures. That's I like that. That's great. Cool. All right. Well, then we'll go ahead and move on to question number 2. And this is from, I can't tell if it looks like Andrea or Andrea. I'm not sure. So I apologize if I mispronounced that, but this is about consent best practices. And this is for Diana, but anybody else can jump in too. Do you think consent expires? At what point should we be sunsetting materials?
My really straightforward answers for this is yes, it expires, and you should be sunsetting your materials at the point that that consent has expired. But just to kind of like go back to the first question, one thing I want to bring up for people to think about is informed consent, right? There's the consent where someone's just, we think about it and people say like yes or no. And then there's informed consent. Will people actually understand what they're getting into before they give their answer? So, and I bring this up. So when I got started on my ethical storytelling journey, long before I even knew that that was a term, I read this report called The Practicalities of Informed Consent in Development Photography. It's from Save the Children. And in it, the author, Nabila Idris, says informed consent is a process, not a form. So to what everyone was saying about like, I like to think of it as a conversation, one that you have repeatedly. You're building a relationship with this person who's going to share some very personal details about their life. You want to continue to have that conversation. Make sure, like Clay was saying, to put the options to say no or yes, like on the table in front of them. And for that consent to, you know, be ongoing or to stop, you have to have in your mind, as the person who's publishing the story, how long are you planning to publish that story for, right? Like I took pictures, you know, of people, you know, when I first started my nonprofit career almost like 10 years ago. Like, is it fair for those pictures to still be used by the nonprofit if those people have not given consent, if I'm not even at that organization anymore, or that relationship is not ongoing? So I like to give people a rule of thumb: start with a year, you know, that you're going to be using the consent, so people understand like, okay, this organization is going to use my story or use my photos or my videos for a year, right? And then after that year, go back and talk to them again. Make sure you got their consent materials. And yeah, I'll let anybody else jump in here.
Well, there's a question about, someone asked a question about language. Making sure not like it's in different language, like it could be in Spanish or it could be in, I'm sure you guys would agree that it should be in the language, you know, that they feel most appropriate.
Yeah, absolutely. Because that's the other
Allie
thing too.
would probably say that very much.
Yeah. I mean, you see that at hospitals, right? Like you have to be able to understand what somebody's telling you.
I think 100%, and to be informed consent, right, that Diana's talking about, they have to actually understand. And first and foremost, language. And to the question about sunsetting, I think also too, don't look at it just as a amount of time. What are they consenting to? I do not like when I see consent forms that say you consent to let us use this for marketing or fundraising purposes. Be specific, because they need to understand the implications. There's a big difference between you putting my picture on a pamphlet you hand out at, you know, conferences versus putting me on a billboard, right? So when it's so broad, so when the purpose of that consent, right, if it's specifically, we are going to use you on a pamphlet that we hand out at conferences in the next 2 months, or for this purpose, it ends when that purpose ends. And then if you need to use even that same material again, go ask them again. Make sure they're comfortable with that new use. So I do urge people to think about consent also like on a project basis.
So one of the biggest things that oh yeah, go ahead, Clay.
Sorry, Ali touched on it. Dinah did too. We know what marketing and fundraising mean usually. More often, hopefully, like that's not always true, but like we try. The people that we're asking to tell stories don't. They don't know what it means to be a nonprofit. They don't know what it means to market and fundraise. And I think in seeking consent, in seeking engagement, we need to explain what it is we're doing. We're a nonprofit. This is what we do. This is the work that we do, and reframe the approach. You're not sharing your story with us for us to use. You are becoming a part of this work of us fundraising, program delivery, the beneficiaries. We are all in this together. We're inviting you to be a part of this with us by sharing your story and becoming not just somebody that's providing this story and this stuff and picture and stuff to use, but part of the fundraising, engagement, marketing, community building of all of it. They're not a resource, they're part of the team.
Do y'all find that people are more likely to tell their story if they feel confident in the process and the consent and those types of things? I would figure so.
I think they feel more in control of the process.
Yeah.
Because I mean, you know, kind of going back to the beginning, why would they say yes, right? Like you got to think about that power dynamic, because if you're not giving them all of the information or the option to say no, they might be feeling obligated. So at the end, they may share their story, but did they do it from like a place of trust and a place of confidence and security versus one of like, oh, like I have to do this, one of obligation.
Well, I just saw, yeah, go ahead.
Incredibly good point in the chat about keeping in mind that once something is published, especially online, it can be circulated. We have to be looking at this in the world of AI now, because once it's online, once it's out there and LLMs start learning from it, right? We need to be prepared for that and to share with people that can happen. There are further down the line ramifications of what could happen. So being very careful with all of those nuances and the potential that it is, regardless of whether we say we're going to sunset it or use it once, the potential that it is out there for time is a thing, especially in the world of AI now.
And become part of the beast. Oh, that's a scary thought. Well, we got some good questions in the chat that actually go to the next question. And this is probably the one that's sticking in a lot of people's heads. So this is from Aisha. But many, many people asked this question, including Nardos, Jessica, and Sandra, and some others. This has to do with consent for minors. Now, we're going to start with Ali, and certainly everyone has experience with this that I'm sure they'd like to share. How do you handle consent when it comes to content featuring children?
This is probably the most asked question that I see in general in my practice. And so before I dive into the actual question, I want to do a little legal background info that I think is really helpful, not just for this question, but our entire discussion today. We talked a lot about ethics. And so what's the difference between legal and ethics, right? So the first thing I want to point out is lawyers, we get a bad rap because we say it depends a lot. And so I don't want to say that, but we've got 400 people here from probably 50 different states. And so it really is going to depend when we talk about the legal. Different states may have different requirements. And so when we're talking about consent for children, there may be some states that say it's okay. A child can consent or in certain circumstances, right? You may also need to consider, do you operate in more than one state? Because it may be different. What if the person you're interviewing is in a different state? So while I do not like to say it depends, it really depends. But that doesn't mean that the answer is not out there. It just means looking into what the specific requirements are for your organization. The other two big ones are your contracts and grants. If you have especially government funded programs, take a look at those grants. A lot of times there are provisions about consent. I've worked in a program where it did have a specific, you have to sunset the provision after a year. Every year you need to renew that consent. So look there, accreditation standards, right? How many organizations on here are accredited? Take a look at those standards. They may have specific rules governing consent. So that's why it really does depend. The second part of that is when I was talking about what's the difference between legal and ethics. So there's two answers when someone says, can the child consent? The first is the legal, and that's what we just talked about. Maybe, maybe not. But what if the state says, or your rules say, yeah, the child can consent? Ethically, though, should you do that? And so the number one thing, and I've been told I'm a broken record on it, that I say to clients and people is, just because you can doesn't mean you should, right? Just because something's legal doesn't mean you should do it. Doesn't mean it's ethical. And so when we're talking about consent from children, right? Even if you don't need the parent's consent, I believe it's best practices to always get it if you have someone under 18, right? Because like Diana said, informed consent. Can you be positive that the child knows what they're consenting to, that they understand the ramifications of putting this information out there, especially with what Clay just said, right? It's out on the internet. If you can't be 100% certain, which I certainly can, and I've got 8-year-old twins, who if you hear noises, they're going to be home from school. So I apologize. But I personally I would not be comfortable with that. And the other piece is to be really conscious of, you have a parent sign the release. You're interviewing the child, and the child is making statements or body language that to you is indicating they're not really comfortable. Best practice, that's not consent. Even though the parent does, don't be comfortable with that. You don't want to put that child in a position that they're not comfortable with. So all in all, best practice, get the parent's consent, but still, what does the child want to do? You still want to also have conversations with the child. So I know, unfortunately, this is exactly what to do when you are dealing with consent in children, but those are some of the things that you definitely need to take into consideration. So if anyone else has anything to add.
I'd like to add something. So kind of going back to this, making sure people understand, there's a really good tool called the stakeholder test question, which basically just puts the context of what you're doing into someone's everyday life. You could use this with kids very young, you could use it with teens, you can use it with older adults. It basically is something like, let's say like I'm interviewing like my son who's 6, right? Like, and his story is going to be, I don't know, published in the school newspaper. And I say, hey, do you like, okay, so we're going to do this story and it's going to show up in the school newspaper, and I'm going to show him the school newspaper. And I'm going to say, what do you think, like, how do you think you would feel if your best friend saw this? You know, do you think that might be cool? Do you think you might be embarrassed? Like, you know, that's just one example. There could be better examples too, right? And then there's also like the next level of like, as an adult, I know that there's more at stake than just showing up in the school newspaper, because maybe it's also getting published on the district website, for instance, right? Where like anybody can see it. And, you know, so you got to take it at that level. There may be stakeholder test questions at different levels and with different people. Like I like to advise people, if you are going to be interviewing, featuring children or minors, that you invite a guardian, a support person, to be a part of the process with them. So that, because they know them, right? They might, you're a stranger to them. They might not know you. You may have like a short relationship with them. Somebody else who is in their corner can tell them like, hey, are you sure you want to do this? You know, check them, you know, if they're, you know, might be doing it to like please you or the organization or whatever.
Anybody else? I think that's really interesting though, about the point, like, and sometimes it may be in the parents who are like pushing it, and you might have to be like, this seems kind of weird. I don't think we're going to do this.
I love Sarah's comment about this as well. The child's own changing opinions, what they feel at 8, 9, 10, 11 years old might be very different at 15 or 16. I think I may just well sum up every comment I'm going to make from here on out, which is reframe it. to Allie's point, like it depends. Can you reframe the story then from the parent or guardian's perspective? Do we have to use the child themselves, or can we approach telling the story differently? So we're just avoiding all of that, right? And best practice will tell us, it's that singular first person perspective. Okay, sure, but let's get creative. And in order to protect these kinds of things, let's look at, can we tell it differently? Can we tell it from a different perspective? Can your program person tell this story about the service from their perspective as the program delivery person, right? And not have to refer to the child at all.
Love it. I think there's some lessons there too, with like anonymous storytelling as well, which I think we'll hit on. Well, we could probably talk about this one all day. We're going to have a lot more about this in the future, so I'll tease that. This is the number one question, of course. But we got a lot of other really good questions too, to kind of dig deeper into some of this. So this is from Sarah, and this is about consent retraction. We're going to give this to Diana and Clay in that order. What do you do if someone previously gave consent and you publish the story and they retract it? Seems like a simple question, but it's actually a little more complicated probably when you involve donors, board members, executive directors, the whole deal. So, Diana, why don't you lead us off?
Yeah, I do think that practicing informed consent as part of ethical storytelling is a best practice, right? There's got to be policies in your organization so that everybody is on the same page. But just from like, you know, a tactical, practical, everyday thing, if somebody gave you their consent and doesn't want to give it anymore and they tell you that, be prepared to take down everything that you can at a moment's notice, right? Like your web developer needs to be on hand, or you need to know how to handle your web thing. But the other thing is that if you follow the process where you're having an informed consent conversation, then at the very beginning, when you're talking to that person, you should have let them know, like, hey, once this goes online, there's only so much that we can take back, right? We can control what's on our website, we can control what's on our social media, but we can't take back shares, we can't take back news articles, news stories, like that stuff is out there. And I say this from personal experience because as much as I try to do this and do it correctly and to the best of my abilities, like I have still made mistakes along the way. So I had an informed consent form where we went through and checked off every single like thing that where I would possibly publish a story. These are young women in their teens, right? So one of that, like we featured them in a local newspaper article. And they had said to me very specifically whether they wanted their last name published, their kid's name published, their ages, like we went through in detail. And I missed a detail. I accidentally published this young woman's kid's age. And she had some reservations about that. She had said no, but it was in the newspaper. Like, how was I going to take that back? Right? Like the only thing that I could do at that point was apologize profusely and go back to my process and figure out where it had gone wrong and add in more checks, right? So as not to repeat the same mistake again.
Thank you for sharing that. I'm sure that was very difficult. I can only imagine.
It sucks. But the thing is like it happens. Like it happens, and this ethical storytelling thing is a journey. And we're all going to make mistakes along the way.
Anything to add?
I would just add, and I think I said this in the white paper. Yes, you get consent up front, but that's the person that you're collecting the story from. Have they seen everything at every step of the way? They get approval. That has to be built into your process. That whatever is written, whatever is published, whatever is done, they see it first, so that they have the chance to weigh in and approve it and adjust the language and be comfortable with it. And if they have any sense of misgiving, of discomfort, of feeling oogie along the way, you pull it. The what's the right word? The subject, the person we're telling the story about,
The
He is
protagonist.
control from minute one. And that's why you have to build the process. And Christy, I'd be kind of curious to hear how you approach that in developing your campaigns and if that rings true with you as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So because I focus on email, consent is really important for storytelling because it's in someone's inbox. So it's similar to like the newspaper situation, where it's just out there and you can't delete an email from someone else's
We've
email.
all tried.
Okay, seriously. So I think when it comes to consent-based storytelling, that's why having those processes in place are so key, because by the time it does end up in someone's inbox, you don't have to question that. And then if they go in and retract it, I mean, I've not been in the position where I've had an organization retract it, so I can't speak from experience. But I think everything that we're talking about with setting up your processes in the beginning, in the first place, is going to prevent those retractions. But let's say it were to happen, of course, I would recommend like the best way to repair things is of course an apology and sending out a retraction email to your list that you sent it to and saying, please delete this from your inbox and ask your community to take care of this person who has asked not to be published anymore.
Ellie, can there be legal ramifications from something like this?
You knew what I was coming to say. So the first thing to start with is, what are they actually signing? And so it's really important because revocation is not going to look the same in every circumstance. Let's think I have somebody who I put their video on our social medias. We have control of that. We can take that down. What if it was used and you used it and you put it on a billboard, right? Or something where you spent a lot of money. It's not the same when they revoke. So as part of what they're signing, it needs to explain revocation in that circumstance. So maybe for the person who it's being used for social media, right? Maybe that can come down. But if what they're doing is broader implications, then you need to put that in what they're signing to explain, yes, they can revoke. And maybe that means we're just not going to use it anywhere else, but we don't have the ability. I mean, you're spending a lot of money. That's the risk assessment. So you need to define, a revocation clause to fit that specific circumstance. And that's also why templates are great, but it's only a template and you need to modify it to fit that particular situation, including the revocation. So I think because you could have legal ramifications too, right? You have an agreement then with, the commercial company, the ad company, and now you're reneging on those. So it can set off a whole chain of legal stuff. And to protect your organization, you got to set forth what they're agreeing to, clear as day.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing about that. All right, next question. This question is from Holly, and it is about organizing consent. This one is for Christy, and of course, anyone who wants to jump in. Can you give me some ideas on how to organize consent forms so that anyone in my organization can see them? A very practical question. I always like these.
Yeah, I love a practical question. I'm so happy I get to speak on this, especially when it comes to organizing, right? The first thing that comes to mind is that often if we're in a small nonprofit, we are so rushed and frantic about everything. And I think that bleeds into the consent conversation heavily, right? Because we often feel in a position where we don't have a choice to follow every policy as it's laid out. So we can talk about policies, but policies are only as good as you actually using them and actually following them and reinforcing them when you're in a leadership position, because we all know when we've had a policy that we push forward, that doesn't mean everyone's going to follow it. As a very type A personality, I have been in that position many a time. So I think this comes down to your organizational structure. And I think, there's not a lot of time to go into this. I will give you all a little context. I used to work for Salesforce. I used to sell their CRM to small nonprofits specifically, right? So I have talked a lot about managing your systems and staying organized. And so when it comes to consent and making it easy for folks in your organization to know if someone has consented to information, it comes down to having a very organized system, right? And it doesn't have to be a complicated system, right? You don't need Salesforce CRM. You don't need that. It can be something as simple as a Google Sheet, as long as that system is secure, right? Because we want to also be aware of like confidentiality. So I think making something online that's secure for your organization, where folks in your marketing as well as program department have clear view on who has consented, along with those expiration dates. I think that's really great. Having a reminder of an expiration date, like some sort of system that can ping you about something expiring, because we're human, we're not going to be able to remember all those expiration dates. So figure out a way to be reminded to at least check, right? Like maybe that's like a monthly audit kind of thing. Like, let's look at our consent stories. It could be something like that, but make sure you have it set in stone when you will be reminded of those expiration dates, so that you can continue that consent. And then of course, making it easy for folks to know what folks have consented to, which of course we've talked about a lot, but making sure that it's clear for your marketing and fundraising team what's actually going on. And using a system like a CRM, I think, is really helpful. But if you're in a position where your organization's very small and you don't have as robust of a system, keep it simple as need be. But I'd love to hear, Diana, what you think about this, because I'm sure you have a ton to say.
I think that was all really great advice, Christy. So the way that I used to handle this is that the informed consent forms, which was different than the media release clauses, were reviewed with the participants of the program once per year and updated and stored in the system that was like the participant client manager. And then what I got to do as over here, communications and development, is I had a privilege to download that report, so that when I was going to go do like the annual report, for instance, and I'm like, okay, I need a couple of stories, then I could pull the report and see like, okay, who has in the last, like, I don't know, 6 months or whatever, like consented to sharing their story, and I could see like who they were, and then I could follow up with them and say, hey, like, we want to do this annual report. It's going to be this, this, and that. Like, you said you were good with sharing your story. Do you still want to do that? It's okay if you say no. And so that was the system that we used. But I mean, to your point, not everybody may have that sort of system. But like one thing that I used to really like to do as a project manager and as a very high J, like off the charts J on the MBTI scale, was naming conventions on folders and documents. You know what I mean? Like make them useful. Like, Diana, expired consent, like something like that, so that people know. Or one piece of advice that I got from one of the past CEOs of Save the Children, who had the opportunity to talk to, was she just said to me, because I inherited a bunch of stories from like way before I started working at this place. I said, can I still use this? And she said, no. Like, she's like, just delete them. Like, why do you need to hang on to something that you no longer have people's consent to use? And I think that there's this very like, I don't know, like we all have like this little squirrely personality inside of us where we want to like save things because we've done them. I don't know why exactly, but like it's okay to like delete stuff that you're not gonna use anymore. Contact information, maybe not,
totally
right? But
agree.
like a
Just delete
particular
it.
story or photos, like I think it's okay. Let's just delete,
Could be part of your policy,
could
after,
be part of the policy. Exactly.
this is when we delete it and this is what we do. And you can inform people of that and they'll be more likely to give a story, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Beautiful. Anybody else to jump in on that one, or we'll charge ahead? All right. This next one is a combo question from Emily and Bev about writing consent forms. This is for Allie and Diana. Is it better to keep the release form short or go as in-depth as possible? What should or must be included on consent form? I'm sure this is very deep. There's a lot that goes into this, but if we maybe a high level,
Yeah.
the high points.
So I'm going to actually reverse it and answer the second part about what must be included, because that's going to inform if it's short or long. You know, when I answer the first question, right, it depends. So the first thing is looking at your requirements. And beyond that, I actually want to flip the script a little. We've talked about what needs to be in there to protect the participant, the person telling the story, right? We've said defining the consent. But you're a representative of your organization. Part of the reason that you're getting consent is to protect your organization. So what must be in there from that standpoint? And so there's three things. I mean, there's a whole list we could come up with, but there's three main things that I often see get overlooked, especially in the nonprofit, because we're not thinking we're doing this for commercial or things like that, right? We're not concerned with that. But what you're creating is still intellectual property. Intellectual property that belongs to the organization. So you need to define that. What does that look like? Who owns it, right? So that's one thing. Compensation. Are they getting paid for this? Now, you may have those conversations. No, they know they're not. Then they come back. It was used out there and they're like, I want to get paid. Nothing in there says it. How do you prove they didn't? You also have the problem then. Now they're not a volunteer and you paid them. So that's got tax and other possible implications. So you want to have something in there. You know, if you are going to pay them, fine, but you got to make sure that's in there. And the third is you often hear consents referred to as a release. So you actually need release language. And what does that mean? You need language that protects the organization from claims of liability, right? That the individual is not going to then sue you for invasion of privacy or things like that. And just like we talked about before, it's got to be tailored to the specific situation. Don't just stick the standard clause you pulled off of Google, because legalese, I don't even understand it, right? You want to tailor it so that it's actually understandable and it fits that situation. And so those are three things that definitely need to be in there. And then as far as the short or long, shorter is always better, but obviously you need to put in what's in there. And I say that because as somebody who routinely clicks accept terms on and doesn't read them, and I have a feeling almost everybody else in this webinar is like that, right? And if we want to do informed consent, right? We're all here because we want the consent to be informed and ethical. We don't want them just checking the box. We don't want them reading the first page and skimming the rest. We want them to read everything. So it needs to be as short as possible within the confines. So that's the it depends answer for this one.
Oh, I have a follow-up question for you, Allie.
Okay.
Because I love this topic. Okay, so you said earlier that like a consent legal document could protect the organization from getting sued. Is it going to actually stop someone from getting sued? They could still sue you even if they've signed the document.
Right. So we live in a very litigious society, and that's not to say that certain litigations are not warranted. What it does then is it's going to protect you, from then having to pay out. Now, I'm not going to say, right, it all depends on the specifics. Anybody can sue you. But when you have that language, right, you're more likely to get it thrown out at the earlier stages, or they have an attorney, then your insurance, right? This is why insurance is so important. And then your insurance is going to cover it and you're going to stop it before it gets to something. But also, these clauses have a pretty good way of stopping people from filing suits because they see that in there, right? And depending on what state you're in, right, you can have provisions that you sue and you lose, you got to pay our attorney's fees, right? So there's a lot of ways. You're never going to stop somebody from suing. It's a risk management game, right? You want to manage your risks. You're never going to get rid of all your risks, but you want to manage them as best you can. And this is one way to do it. But that is a great question, Diana.
Yeah, I think so. That's one of the things that, I've learned through this process is like media release clauses are there to protect the organization, not the client. Whereas if we're looking at this thing from an informed consent perspective and we have an informed consent form where, like I was mentioning earlier, from a publisher's perspective, from being the one that was knowing how we were going to use the stories, like that form had like all of the different ways in which we could publish somebody's stories. It had LinkedIn and Instagram and Facebook and email and grants and reports and annual reports, and like every which place that you could think of that we had that we could possibly publish a story or quote or anything like that was included on that form. It turned out to be, I think, like a page of like check boxes. But like when the direct service staff would go through it with their clients, they would go through and they would talk about like what those things were. That was the informed part, right? Like, because I was always the one hitting the publish button. So I wanted to make sure that when I hit the publish button, that person knew that, like, let's say, you know, they're 17 and in 5 years, they're on LinkedIn as a professional going for a new job, that if they happen to see their story there, or if a potential employer happened to see their story there, they knew that they might be on LinkedIn, that they knew that LinkedIn was a platform for professionals, right? That they had a chance to think through that. And so that's where, like, you know, the contract and the media release clause versus like an informed consent form for the participants, they all work hand in hand, right? They work hand in hand. You've got to have them both. And then the informed consent form also keeps someone from going too far along in the storytelling process and ends up like, you know, something published that they didn't feel good about, or, you know, that they hadn't completely thought through what the ramifications might be. So all of this is just like, you know, checks and balances along the way.
But I think that's such a great point about how you're saying they go through, right? When you have a form, that's the bare minimum. You still need to have that conversation. The form is simply the proof that you did it. It's, you know, that legal. You need to explain it and make sure they understand it. You can't just send that off in an email, sign it. That's not ethical. You know, maybe legal, but it's not ethical.
It's like the Venn diagram of ethical and legal. It could be ethical, it could be one of the two, or it could be both.
That's the constant Venn diagram that's in my brain every day.
Well, that's good. That's great to think about that stuff. It's very important. So, well, cool. All right. Well, let's go on to the next question. We have a couple more minutes, so we'll kind of round things out. We could obviously do this all day. So this next question is from Catherine, and it is about anonymous storytelling. And this is for Clay and of course others. What type of consent is required when telling a client story, even if it's anonymous? For example, we remove the name and all identifying factors, or use an alias. Can you share a little bit about thoughts on that?
I mean, Allie, I kind of want to defer that to you, right? I can't speak to what the legal ramifications of that are, right? And it's a case where I would say, well, check with your legal counsel, your board of directors, where are the potentials for exposure, for liability, all of those questions play into it. That said, right, if you are using a specific story that has, unless you're completely anonymizing the entire situation, right, which then means, are you really describing your programs? Are you really describing your mission? Are you making it up? Like, what is it? How do you remove any identifiable aspect of it? I would say you still need consent if you're using a specific story. That to check with your local Allie Levine, right? Yeah, exactly. We all need one. We need like a little pocket. Like, it's I'm gonna use your phrase, Allie. It depends.
I mean, but you're spot on even from a legal perspective, because our brains think we hear anonymous that we're just talking, their name is gone. Anonymous means I can't identify who that is, or anybody can't, right? My mother reads something in the paper and she's going to figure out that's me. It's not anonymous. And like Clay said, you're doing that, then it defeats the purpose of storytelling. So I 100% will say you need to treat anonymous the same as you are treating named. It's no different. You're telling their story.
Where's the line? I guess that's the question, I think, is like, what makes it truly anonymous? I guess that's that's maybe a difficult question to answer.
It is, but I think it's you need to err on the side of caution, is how I see it, because there is no black and white.
Can't
right?
just change a couple letters.
I am
their name.
I'm big though on composite stories. Maria, thank you. That's the word.
Yep.
I'm big on composite stories.
Beautiful.
I worked a lot in performing arts, right? So I can talk a lot about performing arts education programs. I can talk about the impact on educational outcomes that those programs have for the kids that participated in a global perspective. And I can say, little Jack Horner, right, participated in our program and did better in school. Boom, done. That's a generic story that I can describe that applies to hundreds, thousands of kids that came through the program. But I'm always going to put a caveat in the letter that says, right, Jack's name is not an actual name. This is not a, right, some sort of caveat that says, hey, this is the work that we do. Names and the details have been changed to protect anonymity. I personally, in drafting letters, will often use a phrase like, just as you would not want us to share your story of giving specifically, so too do we, care for those that go through our programs, right? So we're making that connection in that way, but being cautious as you do it and being aware that there can be potential ramifications, and at any point that anybody could look at something and go, I know that kid. I know who that kid is.
Yeah.
And is remotely identifiable. Have that consent, background, whatever it is, the legal support that will back you up on.
Well, before we get to the last question, I thought, Christy, it might be good to share on this one. I wanted to make sure we hit it because it has a practical implications. This is from Jessica. How do you manage expectations from funders and partners and train them to value the time and effort it takes to collect and share stories ethically? That's a very deep question, and we don't have a ton of time, but it would be good if you could touch on that a little bit.
So absolutely. So, I mean, for those of us who are fundraisers, which I imagine most of us are, and marketers, anyone who's dealing with funders and donors, it can be touchy. And a lot of this comes down to your organizational culture. You can't, as an individual, do a ton. You can't be the only person pushing this with your partners and funders, which in some organizations I have been, and I got burnt out trying to do it. So you need some kind of partnership, especially with those in leadership who interact with a lot of your major donors or folks who are a little more influential in the organization, but really all of your funders, even volunteers, because they're donating their time. I think I would always point folks to the CCF principles, community-centric fundraising principles, because those really can help anchor the conversation around how you talk about your organization as a whole, like big picture, and then get down into why the consent piece is a huge part of that. And for folks who are very connected to their community and treat their donors as community partners rather than the transactional piece, which CCF talks a lot about. We're getting away from transactional fundraising into community-centered fundraising. And so it's an ongoing conversation. I think there are some really great resources out there about how to connect with your donors on this specifically. I think of, if you're thinking about major donors, Sarah Staker and Laura Vitelli are two really great consultants who do a lot of values-based major donor work, who can help with that, especially those one-on-one conversations. But I think building it into your language, I do email fundraising, right? So constantly reminding folks, like, we're sharing the story and why it matters and why it's important to have your partnership, and not treating them as if they are like in charge of things or better than anyone because they've donated or they've partnered with you. But taking away that kind of hierarchy as much as you can within your organizational culture will then bleed into the way you interact with your funders and your partners too, which is like the best way I can sum it up, but that could be a whole separate webinar.
Well, I think I'd like to give everybody a last sort of platform right here, since we're all so passionate about this subject. We'll kind of go, this is just a general question for everybody, anything that we touched or anything that new that we didn't get a chance to talk about. What final piece of advice do you have for everybody, or something you want to reiterate? We'll go Christy, Diana, Allie, and then we'll round it out with Clay.
My biggest piece of advice is don't be too hard on yourself, honestly, because
Nice.
as a type ENFJ Myers-Briggs, anyone, as someone who's very intense and can be very much a perfectionist, I think often we can get really shamed in these conversations and feel shamed, like, oh no, I messed this up, I might mess this up. And I think don't be so hard on yourself. And the key is like changing, shifting the culture of how we do storytelling and fundraising is a big lift. Like, you're not going to get it right immediately. And so coming to conversations like this, I think you're doing great, and try not to be hard on yourself. Take the steps you need to do better next time.
Beautiful.
Mm.
Next, Deanna.
Everything that Christy said, right? This is a ethical storytelling is really like a movement. Not any one of us is going to be able to do it by ourselves. We have to change ourselves, our perspectives, our teams, and then our nonprofits, and then our boards, and then the industry as a whole, right? This whole thing is a journey. We're all at different stages on it. So wherever you are, welcome. I want to encourage people that, I think a lot of somebody asked one of the questions in the Q&A, like, I feel icky about even like using stories to raise fundraising, because a lot of what we talked about is, has kind of like a negative kind of perspective on it, but storytelling can be very impactful for communities, for the storyteller themselves. So don't shy away from it. It's a challenge, but you can do this. And do it in community, like the people that you meet that are on here on the chat, like all of us, find us on LinkedIn, like have these conversations. And if you want to go deeper, please come to the Ethical Storytelling Summit. I'm sorry, the Ethical Nonprofit Summit, because that's exactly what we're doing.
Excellent. Allie.
So I think the last thing that I want to touch on is, I talked earlier about, especially if you're grant funded or things like that, and you have requirements. From my experience, both in-house and outside, usually the only people who had that familiarity with those requirements were in compliance or director of programs. But what I urge everyone to do, regardless of your position, whether you are in marketing, familiarize yourself with those, because ultimately you're the one who's kind of responsible, right? You're representing the organization. So you should know what your requirements are. And, sometimes those things can be very confusing. So seek out, talk to people who understand them, or hopefully understand them. But don't be afraid to, just because compliance or legal is not your area, if it touches what you're doing, you should know what those requirements are. So I urge everyone, if they haven't done that, to go ahead and do that.
Clay, bring us home.
I'm going to preface this by saying I love fundraisers. I love what you do. I am here to champion and support you. It's why I've been doing this for 30 years. I think the work that we do is the most important. And you, as fundraisers and marketers, are standing in a tough gap, right? We stand between real life, real world problems and people that want to and can help them. And so I say all of that to say this with love and respect. Nobody owes you their story. Nobody owes you their story, and no donor owes you their contribution. Where we have to stand is in building the trust. And if you've seen the Edelman Trust Barometer, the nonprofit sector lost 5 percentage points in trust. People trust small businesses more than they trust the nonprofit sector. Everything that you do, approach it with building trust, building community, and building honest, open, true dialogue that everyone is brought into, from the people who share their stories, the people that are working on the stories, the people that are receiving the stories, that we are in honest, true, open dialogue that everybody has agreed to be a part of and understands we're here to solve a problem. And secondly, if I could, please stop for a minute and figure out why you are so rushed and so busy. Fix the system, please, so that you can take the time to build things like what we've been talking today, because this is important in building that trust. Whatever it is, that the napkin colors for your gala, that can wait, right? Do that later, do this first.
Beautiful. Way to take us home. I think that was very inspirational, but everybody, really fantastic job. Thank you all,
Thank you.
especially our panelists. I certainly learned a lot today. I could talk about this all day over a bonfire sometime, hopefully. But I love this stuff. And so thank you so much. Attendees, if you have a few minutes, I'm going to share a little bit about MemoryFox in a second. If y'all want to hang out and just watch how it works and give you the high level. Let's see. I want to make sure I say some things. We have a Narratives with Integrity LinkedIn group if you're interested. Carly's going to go ahead and drop that in the chat if you're interested in joining and continuing this conversation. If you've not downloaded your copy of the 2023 Ethical Storytelling Report, go ahead and grab that. There's a lot of excellent advice in regards to ethical storytelling, consent, etc. And finally, I hope to see you all at our next installment of Narratives with Integrity. Save the date. For Wednesday, December 4th at 3 p.m., we're going to be discussing all aspects related to storytelling with minors, which was a topic that was obviously very important today, and we hear about so often. Carly's going to go ahead and drop that link so you can save the date. So without further ado, I'm going to figure out how to share my screen real quick, and I'm just going to give a little quick overview of how MemoryFox works. All right, let's see. Hopefully everyone can kind of see my screen now. I'm going to present. And so, yeah, just at a high level, a lot of this consent stuff that we talked about, like our obsession is building all this into MemoryFox. And so what we've built, it's sort of an end-to-end digital management digital asset management platform for social good, for people who need real stories from real people and everything that goes into that, right? Helps you stay on the track when it comes to ethical storytelling, consent, collecting consent. We have the ability for people to withdraw consent if they no longer want their story to be public. We're going to be building all kinds of cool stuff when it comes to consent, but at a high level, it really just makes it easy for you to be able to collect stories using our web application. It's very simple. You just send out a link, and they just click the link, and then they can see what you want them to share, and they can share that from the comfort of their own home or out in the field or whenever. And you can be able to collect those stories ethically from the people. And the consent, you'll be able to build in your own custom consent that they'll have to agree to before they submit the story, which will allow you to be able to track consent over time to make sure that you're using your stories ethically. And a lot more to come as we build those things in. Then you'll have all those stories consolidated and curated on the cloud. So your whole team can access them. You can control who can see what, or you could just see them yourselves, but all your stories and content will live in one place. It'll be tracked by who sent it, when they sent it, who it was it approved for use, does it have consent, etc. And then you can take those stories and you can either use the design tools that we built, or you can drag them right into Canva, and you can take those stories, build composite stories out of them, or you can just jazz them up and get them ready for Instagram or however you want to share them, or for your newsletters, etc. So there's a lot of really cool things you can do, from collecting to curating your stories, designing them, and then actually putting them to work and helping you share your story ethically. So like I said, integrated with Canva. One of the things that's really cool that we're passionate about is we have an equitable pricing model that's based on your 990. So it scales as you do, and it also, smaller organizations need to tell ethical stories just like large ones, right? And so we have it kind of flexed to the size of your organization. So we've had a lot of success with that. And like I said, helps ensure content is collected and leveraged ethically. And as a part of, when you meet with us, we want to make sure you get value out of it, and it's not just like a demo. So we will put together a free DIY storytelling plan for you for some of your upcoming events. And like, we are totally of the mind, like, you can do what we do manually. It's just a lot harder. So feel free, like, just to come and talk to us, and we'll give you the plan, and then you can go off and do great things that on your own. So but we're just very passionate about it. We just love what we do, and meeting all these great nonprofits. Just some examples of customers and how they've used it. So this organization, and we have consent for all of this, Blessman International. So they do actually international mission support. So they collect stories from both their volunteers and the people that they support in Africa. And they've had over 3,000 submissions, beautiful pictures, videos, stories, some really, really, truly amazing stuff that I think would have been very difficult to collect and manage consent for just with like a Google Drive, right? So really, really beautiful stuff. Arbor Day Foundation, which is something near and dear to my heart, of course, love them. They collect a lot of content from their volunteers out in the field as they're executing the mission, which I think is just so cool to get that sort of live action, people like really fulfilling the mission as it happens. And they've done hundreds of collection campaigns. They have one for each sponsor, the dates, locations, really, really tremendous stuff. They share it as part of their impact reports. And they always have new stories that are constantly coming in. So, and they're accessible to their grant writers and their fundraisers. So they just have like a constant flow of beautiful, beautiful stories and content that they can use on social media and grant making. And then, oops, sorry.
For all the wonderful and hard
Well, it is a cool, cool video that you can make. So like what this was made using the Canva integration, Center for Caregiver Advancement, they were able to just pull their testimonials and videos and stories and then build this really cool little this little Instagram piece right here, and very easy to make, right, with Canva for those who have done it. And so a lot of really cool for this campaign, they collected 21 stories. Doesn't always have to be thousands of stories, right? But you can create beautiful content just out of like 21, 15, 10 stories even. And then you can build on the right. You can see that's one of our custom storytelling tools. I kind of based my original thought of it was, I don't know if you all are fans of Humans in New York, which I think is just a beautiful, beautiful concept. And so like taking that, but just kind of making it like a wall of love, a wall of stories that are video instead of like the written way that they do it, to allow you to be able to do it yourself. So I just think that's a really cool thing that I wanted to share with everybody. And then finally, I think this is just such a beautiful organization, Wreaths Across America. They do wreath plantings at all the cemeteries across the country. Even though you don't know them, you've seen their work. And they do it again to collect from volunteers during their annual wreath placing, the placing ceremonies. And they had over 1,000 contributors contribute over 8,000 pictures and videos, which was a good experience for us because we learned how to beef up our servers a little bit because we weren't used to that when we first did it. So really cool, great to learn alongside of them in terms of like how volunteers want to tell stories, how to tell veteran stories, which is something, obviously I'm an Army veteran, so that's something that I'm very passionate about. So yeah, and like we are super down to support all your storytelling needs. Or even if you just want to chit chat about your storytelling and ways that you can, improve some processes and things like that. We just love it. So feel free to join us on our journey. We certainly would love to have you. And feel free to hit me up on LinkedIn or whatever social media. I try to be better about posting, but join our LinkedIn storytelling group if you feel you want to learn more. I may be freezing right now, so that's a good time to say see y'all later and see you next time.